Hello class, welcome to the next segment in the week 2 material, and in this segment we're going to actually introduce the idea of an if statement, which allows us to get our programs to do things in certain situations or to not do things in other situations. It's basically a control mechanism that allows you to control what happens in your program based on the values of certain variables in your program. So that's the whole idea behind an if statement. But before we get too deep into that, let's go ahead and sort of get our bearings straight on this program that we have here. So up here on line 1, we have a simple variable x, which we've set equal to be 10, just a super simple variable that we've been working with previously. And finally, once we get to line 3, we have an example of the if statement, and the reason we can tell it's an if statement is because it uses the word if. So we are very inventive in our terminology. But this particular statement on line 3 is getting the computer to ask if the variable x is equal to 10. And you'll notice up here on line 1 where I'm declaring a variable, where I'm setting a variable equal to some specific value. Notice how I have just a single equal sign here. In the case of an if statement, if I'm asking if a variable is equal to something else, or if I'm asking if any two quantities are equal, then in order to accomplish that, I have to use a double equal sign here. That is two equal signs that are back to back. They appear one after the other. So, and that's another thing that's going to be kind of confusing potentially, is if you're going to ask if something is equal to something else, the double equal sign has to be there. You can't get away with using the single equal sign. If you attempt to do that when you're not supposed to, that is, if you attempt to use a just to use a single equal sign here, you will in fact start getting error messages in the console, and that's probably not what you're after. So here I'm getting the computer to ask if the variable x is equal to the number 10. And then another thing that you'll notice here is I have this colon at the very end of this statement here. So, and this colon is actually very important. And there's other statements like this, other Python functions like this that also require the colon at the end of it. And you'll notice a bit of a trend here, how whenever we have a statement that requires a colon to be at the end here, that usually involves some sort of indented statements that appear below it. So that colon has to be there. One of the nice things about Spider is when you go to write a statement that uses a colon, then it will usually automatically add the colon for you. But if you start getting say, a syntax error message saying, pointing to the end of a line, and it's saying colon expected or something to that effect, then it means you forgot the colon somewhere. So just a couple things to keep in mind right away about if statements is double equal sign if you're asking if one thing is equal to something else. And then also the colon at the very end here must be there. There's no getting around it. And so finally, let's get down to the indentations here. So right below this if statement, we have some indented statements. Now, the way that this is going to work is in Python, if this condition here, of this thing that we're testing right here turns out to be true, that is, if the variable x is in fact equal to 10, then whatever is indented below that if statement is going to actually run. So in this case, we're asking if the variable x is equal to 10, and if that's the case, then we were going to get the computer to print yo, and we were also getting the computer to print what's up in the console here. And if this condition fails, that is, if x is not equal to 10, then whatever is indented will in fact be ignored. So this allows you to get your program to do certain things in certain situations, and allows you to control how your program sort of functions based on the values that are actually stored in the computer's memory. The technical term for this that you'll often hear is the idea of control flow, basically allows you to control how your program functions based on what values are currently stored in the computer's memory. So in this case, if we want, in this particular program, if x is in fact equal to 10, then we want the computer to do these things. And we want the computer to print out yo, and we want the computer to print out what's up. Just a simple example to sort of give you sort of first look at how all this works. And then down here, I have another if statement. So here I'm asking if the variable x is equal to 0. And again, if that condition is true, then whatever is indented below that, whatever is indented immediately below that, will actually run. And if this condition fails, then the indented statements are going to be ignored. And finally, down here on line 10, we have just a regular old print statement. There's no blank spaces or anything in front of it, so this is not indented, which means it's not part of any if statement, which means this print statement will run like any other print statement, and this print statement, or any unindented statements in general, will run no matter what happens with these conditions and the if statements that appear above it. So since these print statements on lines 4, 5, and 8 are indented, then these print statements will only run if the condition in this if statement is satisfied. But this print statement on line 10, since it's not indented at all, it will run no matter what happens with these conditions that appear above it. So based on all that, if we were to run this program right now, we would expect this condition to be satisfied, which means we expect lines 4 and 5 to run, which are just two print statements. And then in this if statement, we expect this condition to fail, since we can see x is clearly not 0. So that means this statement will be ignored. And then finally, at the end of this program, we have this bit on line 10, and that print statement will run no matter what happens with these two if statements. So in general, so in summary, we would expect the program to print out yo, what's up, and then this will appear no matter what the value of x is. And if we want to run that program, there we go. You can see we do in fact get that result that we expected. Another thing that should be noted about the indentations is they have to be consistent. And all these indentations are is just a bunch of extra blank spaces. And you can accomplish this by a couple means. You can just tap the spacebar a few times or as many times as you please. Or if you want to, you can just hit the tab key and that will automatically add spaces for you. So that's one nice thing about Spider is you can quickly get those indentations by just hitting the tab key and it will automatically put those blank spaces in for you. But a couple things to note about the indentation themselves is these indentations do have to be consistent. So here I have this indented 3 spaces, which means any other statements that are also part of this if statement or this if block, those also have to be indented by 3 spaces. And if you try to test that rule out, say you add one too many spaces, then you'll get unexpected indent error. And if you have too few spaces, then you'll see this very long error message saying unindent does not match any outer indentation level. And if you see any of those two error messages, then in all likelihood, it means that your indentation was not consistent. Either you hit the space bar by accident when you weren't supposed to, or you left an extra space in front of a statement that you didn't mean to put there. And another thing that's kind of interesting is you can also put anything you want to on the left and right hand side of the equal signs as long as it's valid mathematically. So I could also test if the value of x multiplied by 2 is equal to 10, which we can sort of deduce that is not the case. So it's 2 times 10 would be 20, and 20 is not equal to 10. But that is something that we could do. As long as what appears on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, the double equal sign, as long as that's valid mathematical syntax in Python or just valid Python syntax in general, then you can put it on either side of the double equal sign. And unlike the single equal sign, which the order is important, is set in stone, that is the value must go on the right-hand side and the variable must go on the left-hand side. In the case of the double equal sign, the order is actually not important. You can put this in any order. So I could also put it in this order, although this may not make very much sense from a plain English point of view. So I'm asking if the value of 10 is equal to the value of x, as opposed to, say, an order that is a little bit more natural, where you're asking if the value of x is equal to 10. But either one will work. And if another thing that you might encounter, especially if you're really new to this, is if you just don't have the indented statement. So if you don't indent at all below an if statement, then you will get this error message saying expect an indented block, which basically means you have to go in here and add some extra spaces. So if we want to also test this even further for the sake of completeness, we can go in and change this value of x from 10 to 0. And if you want to, even feel free to pause the video and try to figure out what this program is actually going to produce in the console if I were to run it right now. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. And hopefully that the answer that you came up with will match what I'm about to illustrate here. So again, we go down here, we test this condition. We ask if the variable x is equal to 10. Since we can see x is 0, that condition fails. So both of these indented statements that appear below this if statement will be ignored. So the computer is not going to print any of these or act on any of these commands. Down here we have a condition where we're asking if the variable x is equal to 0, which we can see is the case. So that condition is met, which means this indented statement is something the computer will actually act on. So here the computer should print out by, including the exclamation mark. And again, just like before, this statement on line 10 is unindented, meaning it will run no matter what happens with the if statements that appear above it. So hopefully the answer that you arrived with is this, the computer printing out by, and also the computer printing out this will appear no matter what x is. So that's going to do it for this first look at if statements. And in the next several segments, we're going to take a look at some of the other combinations that you can put inside these conditions here. So here we're asking if two variables are equivalent, but there are other operations that we can perform in these if statements, and we're going to cover those operations in the next several segments. So with that, I will see you all in the next segment.